Hello, welcome back to our Bible Babble here on Monday. So that means it's Old Testament Monday. I'm glad you could join us again. Today we are going to pretty much finish off the story of Jericho and what happened there. I'll warn you now, it kind of ends with a question. And we'll get to that. So, recap. The Israelites had crossed the Jordan into the land of Canaan, the land of milk and honey, the promised land that God had promised them. And what they knew going into this is that they were going to have to not just walk in, but it was actually going to be fighting for their territory again. And when they crossed the Jordan, the first settlement they came to was Jericho. And in all likelihood, Jericho was there to protect an area where the Jordan River was sometimes crossed. It was guarding the approach to the rest of the territory there. So they got across the river, and I'm just going to read the beginning of Joshua chapter 6. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went in, and no one came out. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram horns in front of the ark. And on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. And when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in." Okay, heck of a promise from God. Why did God promise this? Other than the fact that, the children of Israel were his covenant people. Well, first of all, as I said, it's because Jericho was kind of controlling entry into the valley, the Jordan Valley, and into the rest of the area of Canaan that they wanted to go to. And they couldn't very well go past it and leave a hostile force at their back. That was a recipe for disaster. Even 3,000, 4,000 years ago, people knew better than that. So, when you came to a fortified location, you had a couple of choices. You either attack it head on, and hopefully you have enough soldiers that they can overcome the soldiers inside and eventually gain entry. But that's typically kind of a bloody business. Or you can surround the city and not let anyone in or out until they either starve enough that they're willing to come out and talk terms or surrender. Or you might be able to cut off their water. That usually shortened up things a little bit. Failing that, there was nothing else that they could do. So, rather than spend a lot of men taking the village or the town, or a lot of time taking the town, because what the Israelites were doing now was striking fast, God showed them this way to take the city in a week. Excuse me, I have a cold. or allergies. So, God came up with this sort of novel approach. Have your soldiers, and we don't know how many there were, a couple hundred, couple thousand, unsure at this point. Put some priests in front with these ram's horns, which you couldn't really play a tune, but they could, make sounds, stuff like that. And then the Ark of the Covenant would be there. And then the soldiers would walk behind. And every day they would walk around Jericho once. 6 days. And on the 7th, which is very interesting because the 7th would be the Sabbath day, and you would think, maybe they shouldn't be doing this on the Sabbath, but that doesn't seem to be a problem here. They were to march around the town 7 times, and then at the end, all of the soldiers go, "Brah! We're coming to get you!" or something like that. And then the walls would collapse and they'd be able to go into the city. They didn't have a lot of options. Plus, I'm sure they were being very faithful at this time. So they said, okay, that's what God says, we'll do that. So they march around Jericho. Now, did some research, and it appears that because they've excavated ancient Jericho, which is a little over a mile from modern-day Jericho. And they found remains of walls. The walls would have been about 6 feet thick and about 12 feet high. So, serious defensive walls. But the interesting thing is when you look at the size, the area that they enclosed, it wasn't that big. Which makes it look like it was more of a fortification, also with civilian occupants than, any sprawling major city. In fact, the circumference, walking around Jericho, around the walls that they found, was about 2,000 feet, roughly. So you consider it would be like a half a mile walk. So it's not like walking around even Salem or Paddock Lake or anything like that. But still, that was the command, and they did that. And it's not. I'm not intending to imply that it's an insignificant fortification, because back in those days, that would have been a respectable fort, because the populations back then were in the hundreds or maybe thousands of people. We did talk about that last week, that these huge numbers that get reported are by the tradition of ancient writing, which tended to inflate things substantially. That's where the numbers, really big numbers, came from. So they're walking around the camp. They do it 6 days. We can imagine by the end of the 6th day, the soldiers are kind of, checking their watches, like, oh gosh, man, this is really boring. And Joshua says, oh, no, just wait. 7th day, tomorrow, stuff's going to happen. So they march, break of day, 7th day, and they march around once, and twice. 3rd time, they march around 7 times. And then the priests would blow the horns. The men all yell. And sure enough, the walls come down. And the inside of this fortification is just laid bare. And the army of the Israelites charges in. And here's where the question comes. I'm going to read you what it says here in Joshua chapter 6. Verse 17. These are Joshua's instructions to the troops. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies that we sent. Remember, we talked about that a couple weeks ago. Prostitutes, probably just a loose translation because they tended to define innkeepers as prostitutes as well, for whatever reason. And then he goes on to say, all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are sacred and must go into God's treasury. Everything else is to be devoted to God. What does that mean? And when you look at the Hebrew verb, or the Hebrew word for devoted to God, you find that it means everything must be destroyed. People, animals, houses, everything. And to our modern sensibilities, that seems difficult to understand. You know, we tend to focus more on the New Testament, where, you know, the God we see, the God Jesus talks about, most often is conceived and seen as a God of love. You know, it's hey, love everybody. I'm a compassionate God. And here we have the instructions being basically, you know, the t-shirt that says, hang them all, let God sort them out. It's basically what the instructions are. Save Rahab and her family, kill everyone else. And how do we square that with the God that we know? Now, you can find some solace in the idea that when you dig further into what devoting something to God means, in the case of a town, it means you destroy it utterly so that there's nothing there that could rise up against God, basically. Nothing there that anybody else could use. And that can mean not killing everybody, but driving everybody out of the town. You know, chasing them out, burning their homes, destroying their livelihoods, which you could look at and say, well, I guess that's not as bad as killing everybody. But still, that's kind of harsh. And the only answer you see after that is that, well, the only one I see anyway, is that these were different times. God was trying to return his people to their territory. And the way these things happened in those days was that if there was somebody there, there was no way to go in and make a treaty with them and say, hey, you know what, we really like this place here, we like what you've done with it, but it's got to be ours because our God said, you know, that we had to have this and you had to leave. If they approach any kingdom or any town, any fort with that with that line of thought, they'd be laughed out of there. Well, honestly, they'd probably be killed. And then they'd all, you know, the other side would all have a good laugh. But it was different times. And maybe that means that God is somehow contextual too. God relates to us in the context of the society in which we live. And if that means utterly obliterating a town in order to achieve the end that God wants to achieve, maybe that's what God does. Maybe that's what he directs us to do. And I gotta be honest, that's not really comfortable to me. But it seems to be the way things are consistently in the Old Testament. Because we see this time and again as they work their way further into the territory. If there's a town or kingdom, whatever you want to call it, the words get kind of interchangeable in Hebrew. That if there's one of those in the territory that they're supposed to have, they wipe it out. They develop quite a reputation, apparently, as raiders and soldiers. So the question we're left with is, what does that mean for us as we look back? And the answer is, I don't know. I'm not smart enough, certainly, to judge what happened. But I would like to understand it. And the closest I can come is that idea that God works through us in the context of the culture that we find ourselves in. Maybe by 1st century AD, things had changed enough that God could start to look at being, in living with, working within that context of being more loving and forgiving. But I don't know. There's probably problems with that too. So this is something I'm going to continue to think about. I encourage you to think about it too. See where it takes you. Maybe we can talk about it sometime. But the story ends with Jericho being devoted to God, basically erased. Rahab and her family are saved, and the Israelites are poised to move further into the Promised Land. And that's where we end today. Tomorrow we'll be back, New Testament Tuesday. I hope to see you then. In the meantime, stay healthy and stay safe. Have a great evening.